Welcome to another episode of the Federal Church Presents Better Than Bloomberg. Today we're covering the banking collapse 2023. Yeah, Zero Hedge had another good note up. Fed balance sheet exposed by $300 billion as bank bailouts lead to record discount window surge. Earlier today we said that Wall Street freaking out over the latest bank crisis. Everyone's attention would be focused on today's weekly H41 update from the Fed. They weren't disappointed because what we found was striking. In the week ended March 15th, borrowings under the Fed's deeply stigmatized last-ditch liquidity facility, the discount window, exploded to $152.85 billion, a record $148 billion weekly jump to an all-time high, which surpassed even the borrowings during the financial crisis. And why is that? It's because the insolvency this time around is much worse than the financial crisis in 2008. Now, there was another good note, which we'll go over in another video, where apparently they were confusing liquidity with solvency. Yeah, congratulations, you gave them a nice little liquidity infusion there. Your bank's still insolvent. And who the hell would leave their money there? But we'll get to that in a minute, or a few minutes over here. Finish up with this this note. Look at that. Look at that. 152.8 billion. And here is 2008. Again, this is much worse than 2008. In 2008, the toxic assets were the more complicated, more esoteric securities that not everybody traded. This is the plain vanilla garbage toiletries that everybody trades. Just as importantly, those curious what the usage of the Fed's new buy the fucking pivot facility would be, got their answer, and the Fed won't like it. At just $11.943 billion, this was a very small amount, as banks clearly fear the stigma associated with the buy the fucking pivot program, even more than they loathe the discount window. So even though the Fed came up with a little supposed solution, nobody's going to use it because it looks pretty fucking bad when you do. I.e. tanking your share price and your debt prices. And then the insurance on your fucking debt too, or the swaps. So when that happens, you doing business becomes a little bit more difficult. This in line with what Goldman suggested, while use of the buy the fucking pivot is the most straightforward measure of the extent to which deposit outflows are putting banks under pressure. Many banks say they will only use the buy the fucking pivot once they have exhausted other funding sources such as the FLHB advances, the CD issuances, and the wholesale debt market, which also is funny because it's all impacted by the toiletries and raising rates in the mega inflation scenario that they're in. Clearly, many banks are staying away. I don't know what this is factors affecting. It's funny they had their little SDR BS in here too. Who cares? Some other garbage too. More printed money garbage. They have like the SDR things here, which I haven't seen any changes yet. But the Fed needs to be bailed out. Probably will. And let's circle this primary credit and buy the fucking pivot program. Nobody wants to be using it. Of course, as discussed earlier, we won't know the names of the banks that use the two facilities due to their deeply stigmatizing nature, i.e., making it impossible for them to do business for the next 2 years, tanking their share price. Taken together, the credit extended through the two backstops showed a banking system that remains broken and is dealing with over $100 billion in deposit migration in the wake of the failure of Silicon Valley Bank of California and the Signature Bank in New York last week. Which is even funnier because the apparent cheerleading that they had over there on the Talking Heads networks, they essentially had a little cook in the book scheme where all the deposits that migrated to the bigger banks, the banks are now just recycling back into the other banks, to the smaller banks. But now they have no depositors, and all they have is, an insolvent capital base. So, it doesn't really effing matter. But it's just something ridiculous. But it all made them feel better for a few hours until they kind of figured it. Until people figure out there's no material difference. They're still sitting on trillions of toxic debt. And then the Fed also revealed that 142 billion in reserves were, and he had another note on that. We'll go over that in a few minutes. Were released by other credit extensions. This line item was $0 last week, and includes loans that were extended to depository institutions established by the FDIC. The Federal Reserve Bank's loans to the money changers are still lying about the Reverend here and telling people to drug his food. The Federal Reserve Bank's loans to these depository institutions are secured by collateral, and the FDIC provides repayment guarantees, which again is also retarded in the form of demand deposits, including loans that were extended to depository institutions established by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The Federal Reserve Bank's loans to these depository institutions are secured by collateral, and the FDIC provides repayment guarantees. At the consolidated level, the surge in new liquidity created by the Fed meant that the Fed's balance sheet rose by 297, its biggest jump since April 2020, and erasing 4 months of quantitative tightening, or half the entire program. What I mean is, you're going to give it inflation, and you're all poor. Separately, earlier today we reported that JP Morgan's Nick Pennant, whatever the fuck his name, estimated that the Fed's new buy the fucking pivot facility could rise as much as $2 trillion, and suggested that as a result of the massive reserves created by this facility, it could serve as a stealth QE. Well, it's not really a stealth QE when everybody's fucking watching it. However, at $11 billion per week, we will have to wait quite some time to get to JPM's target. Putting it together, we said that we live in an interesting time when the Fed is hiking. The Fed is shrinking its balance sheet, and the Fed is also engaging in stealth QE in hopes of injecting trillions in reserves in small banks. The time to be alive, the Fed is hiking, raising rates, shrinking its balance sheet via QT, and then injecting $2 trillion in liquidity via the Buy the Fucking Pivot program, which is supposedly stealth QE. No, it's just fucking printing money and issuing debt to print that money, or issuing debt by printing that money. We can now say for that all intents and purposes, QT is over, and as long as deposit flight continues, the Fed's balance sheet will keep rising. And again, who in their right mind would keep their money in insolvent banks? Just to find out what fractional reserve banking means. Not to mention why the risk-free treasuries are no longer risk-free. But that was one article there, and we'll go over to the next few notes where talk about the shenanigans of this garbage, which again is worse, much worse than 2008. Oh, and it's even funnier too when you watch the Bloomberg or the CNBC type shows where they're just constantly cheerleading. And if you were watching that stuff back in 2007 and 2008, you would have seen the same kind of crap as it was all coming down. So it's just funny to see that all over again too. Get on to those new notes.